The bid started at $20. Nobody raised a hand. The auctioneer dropped it to 10. Still nothing. Then 5. The crowd at the Whitewood Livestock Auction had already moved on in their minds, eyes drifting toward the next pen, the next possibility. The mare stood in the corner of the holding area, one rear leg cocked awkwardly, ribs pressing through a dull bay coat that had lost its shine months ago. Her breathing came in short, rattling pulls that you could see more than hear. She wasn't just thin. She was surrendering. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Jack Thornton stood near the back rail, his left hand resting on weathered wood, his right eye doing all the work it could. The blind eye, the one that had stopped seeing 3 years ago when a gate spring snapped and caught him across the face, still looked forward out of habit. But it saw only shadows now, vague shapes that his brain had learned to fill in with guesswork. He'd gotten good at pretending the world was still whole. $5, the auctioneer called out, his voice stripped of enthusiasm. Anyone? $5 for lot 42. She's got papers, she's got bloodlines. Just needs some groceries and time. Papers didn't feed a horse. Time didn't pay for medicine. The crowd knew it. Jack knew it too. But when he looked at that mare, teetering on legs that barely held her weight, something old and buried turned over in his chest. It wasn't pity exactly. It was recognition. He'd seen that look before, in his own reflection, in the months after they'd buried his wife Catherine beneath the cottonwood on the hill. The look of something still breathing but not quite living. His hand went up. Slow, steady, no hesitation. The auctioneer blinked. Sold to the man in the back. Lot 42, $5. A few heads turned. Someone chuckled. Another man shook his head and muttered something about throwing money into a hole. Jack didn't care. He walked toward the pen, boots scuffing the dirt floor, and the mare lifted her head just slightly. Her eyes were dark, wet, exhausted, but somewhere in them was a flicker. Not hope, just awareness. She knew someone had chosen her. Jack opened the gate and stepped inside. The mare didn't move toward him, didn't pull away either. He stood there a moment, letting her take him in. Then he reached out, palm open, and let her decide. Her nostrils flared. Her ears twitched forward, then back. Finally, she took one small step, and her muzzle brushed his hand. Warm, real, alive. We'll figure it out, Jack said quietly, his voice rougher than he meant it to be. You and me. We'll figure it out. The ride back to Thornton Creek Ranch took 40 minutes. Most of it on 2-lane highways that cut through open fields turning gold under the late September sun. Jack drove his old Chevy pickup with the kind of attention that came from years of compensating. He checked his mirrors more than most people, tilted his head to catch the angles his right eye couldn't see on its own. The horse trailer rattled behind him, and every so often he glanced at the side mirror to see the mare swaying inside, her head low, her body braced against each turn. The sky was wide and pale, streaked with high clouds that looked like brushstrokes. The Mission Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks already dusted with early snow. This was the kind of country that didn't forgive mistakes. It was hard land, beautiful land, the kind that made you earn every single thing you kept. Jack had grown up here. His father had run cattle on this same stretch of valley floor, and his grandfather before that. The ranch had been in the family for 3 generations, though it had shrunk over the years, sold off piece by piece to keep the rest alive. Now it was just 600 acres, a house that needed a new roof, and a barn that leaned slightly to the east like it was listening for something. Catherine had loved it anyway. She'd grown up in Billings, never spent a day on a ranch until she met Jack at a county fair when they were both 19. But she'd taken to it like she'd been born to it. She learned to ride, to mend fence, to pull a calf when the weather turned bad and the vet couldn't make it in time. She planted a garden every spring, kept chickens, made jam from wild chokecherries. She'd had a way of turning struggle into something bearable, even good. Then the cancer came. Fast and mean, the kind that didn't care about timelines or second chances. They'd fought it for 2 years. Sold cattle to pay for treatments. drove 4 hours each way to the hospital in Missoula, sat in waiting rooms that smelled like disinfectant and fear, and in the end, none of it mattered. She died on a Tuesday morning in April, with the windows open and the smell of fresh earth coming in on the breeze. Jack had been holding her hand when she went. He'd felt the moment she left, the way her grip loosened, the way the room went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with sound. And when he looked up, the sunlight coming through the window hit him square in the face, and all he saw was white. Blinding, burning white. By the time his vision cleared, she was gone. And the eye that had taken the light never worked right again. The doctor said it was a detached retina, maybe triggered by stress, maybe just bad luck. They did surgery. It didn't take. Now he saw the world in halves. One side clear, sharp, full of detail. The other side a blur of shapes and shadows. A constant reminder that some things, once broken, don't get fixed. He'd tried to keep the ranch going. Hired a couple of hands, ran a smaller herd, focused on what he could manage. But the weight of it had settled on him like snow, cold and relentless. He stopped going into town unless he had to. Stopped answering the phone. Stopped pretending he was all right. The ranch wasn't dying exactly, but it wasn't thriving either. It was just there, like him, going through motions, which made what he'd just done even harder to explain. $5 for a horse that might not live through the week. Another mouth to feed. Another thing to fail at. But when he'd seen her standing in that pen, legs shaking, breath labored, eyes dim but not dead, something in him had cracked open. He didn't have words for it. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was loneliness. Maybe it was the faint, foolish belief that saving something else might prove he wasn't completely lost himself. The truck rattled over the cattle guard at the edge of his property, and the sound pulled him back. The gravel road leading up to the house was lined with fence posts that needed straightening and wire that sagged in places. The fields on either side were empty now. He'd sold the last of the herd 6 months ago, keeping just enough to cover the mortgage and the bills that never stopped coming. The grass had grown tall and wild, bending in waves under the wind. The house came into view first. 2 stories of weathered logs, a stone chimney on the north side, a wraparound porch that Catherine had insisted on. The paint on the shutters was peeling. One of the porch steps had rotted through and he'd patched it with plywood. It wasn't much to look at anymore, but it was still standing. The barn sat 50 yards beyond. Red timber that had faded to rust. A cedar shake roof patched with tin in places. The doors hung slightly crooked, but they still opened. Inside was space for 8 stalls, though only 2 had been used in the last year. There was a tack room that smelled like leather and oil, a loft full of hay bales he'd bought on credit, and a workbench covered in tools he kept meaning to organize. Jack parked near the barn and shut off the engine. The silence that followed was thick, broken only by the wind moving through the pines and the faint creak of the trailer as the mare shifted her weight. He sat there a moment, hands still on the wheel, staring at the barn doors. This was the point where doubt usually crept in, where the voice in his head reminded him of all the ways this could go wrong. But he didn't let it settle. He climbed out, walked to the back of the trailer, and unlatched the door. The mare stood inside, head low, eyes half closed. She didn't move when the door swung open. Jack stepped up into the trailer, moving slowly, letting her hear his footsteps, his breathing. He clipped a lead rope. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. To her halter. A frayed thing that looked like it had been used hard and never replaced. Easy now, he said. We're home. The word felt strange in his mouth. Home. Like it meant something again. He backed her out carefully, one step at a time, watching her bad leg, the way she favored it, the way her whole body seemed to tremble with the effort. When her hooves touched the ground, she stood there, swaying slightly, nostrils flaring as she took in the new smells. Pine, hay, creek water, earth. Jack led her toward the barn, his pace slow, his grip on the lead rope loose. He didn't pull. He just walked, and after a moment, she followed. Her hooves scuffed the dirt. Her breathing was labored, but she followed. Inside the barn, he'd already prepared the corner stall. Fresh straw on the floor, a bucket of water drawn from the well, a flake of hay pulled from the loft. It wasn't much, but it was clean, dry, and quiet. He led the mare inside and unclipped the rope. She stood there, unmoving, as if waiting for permission. "It's yours," Jack said. "Stay as long as you need." He stepped back, giving her space, and watched as she lowered her head toward the water. She didn't drink right away, just stood there, muzzle hovering above the surface, as if she'd forgotten what to do. Then, slowly, her lips touched the water, and she drank. Small sips at first, then deeper pulls. Jack felt something loosen in his chest. He left the stall door open and walked to the tack room, where he kept an old medical kit he'd used for cattle. Antiseptic, bandages, a thermometer, a bottle of penicillin that was probably expired but might still do some good. He didn't know much about horses, not the way some people did, but he knew enough. Knew that infection was the enemy. Knew that warmth and food and stillness could work miracles if you gave them time. When he came back, the mare was lying down. Not collapsed, just resting, her legs folded beneath her, her head still upright. Her eyes were open, watching him. Jack knelt a few feet away, setting the kit down beside him. "I'm going to call you Ember," he said, "because you're still burning. Barely. But you are." The mare blinked, slow and deliberate. Jack reached out, not to touch, just to show his hand. She didn't flinch. That was enough for now. He spent the next hour checking her over as best he could. Her breathing was shallow and rough, crackling in her chest like dry leaves. Her injured leg was swollen around the hock, hot to the touch. He cleaned the scrapes and cuts along her shoulder and flank, applied antiseptic, wrapped the worst of them in gauze. She tolerated it all without protest, too tired to fight, too beaten down to care. When he was done, he sat back against the stall wall, knees drawn up, and just watched her breathe. In and out, in and out. The rhythm of it was hypnotic, grounding. It reminded him that life, even fragile life, had its own stubborn momentum. Outside, the sun was setting, spilling orange and pink across the valley. The temperature was dropping fast, the way it did in the mountains this time of year. Jack stood, brushed the straw from his jeans, and walked to the barn doors. He looked back once at the mare, her shape barely visible in the dim light. "See you in the morning," he said. He closed the doors gently, latched them, and walked back to the house. The porch creaked under his weight. Inside, the house was cold and empty. He didn't bother turning on lights, just walked to the kitchen, poured himself a glass of water, and stood at the window looking out toward the barn. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called. The wind picked up, rattling the loose shutter on the second floor. Jack set the glass down and leaned against the counter, closing his good eye, letting the exhaustion settle over him. He thought about Catherine, about the way she used to stand at this same window, watching the sun go down, her hand resting on his shoulder. About the way she'd believed in second chances, even when the odds were stacked against them. About the way she'd looked at him the day after his eye went dark and said, "You still see more than most people, Jack. You just have to look harder." He opened his eye and stared out into the twilight. The barn was a dark silhouette against the fading sky. Inside it, a broken horse was breathing. And for the first time in 3 years, Jack Thornton felt like maybe, just maybe, he wasn't finished yet. He didn't sleep much that night. Every hour or so, he'd get up, pull on his boots, and walk out to the barn with a flashlight. Each time, Ember was still there, still breathing, still alive. And each time, Jack would stand at the stall door, watching her in the dim light, before heading back to the house. By morning, the frost had settled heavy on the grass, turning the world white and silent. Jack made coffee, strong and black, and carried it out to the barn as the first light broke over the mountains. Ember was standing when he arrived, her head turned toward the door as if she'd been waiting. "Morning," he said. She didn't move, but her ears flicked forward. Jack stepped into the stall, checked her water, refilled it from the pump outside. He brought her a fresh flake of hay, spreading it out so she could reach it easier. She watched him the whole time, those dark eyes following his every movement. When he was done, He sat down on an overturned bucket and drank his coffee. The barn smelled like straw and animal warmth, and the light coming through the cracks in the walls painted everything in gold. Ember lowered her head and began to eat, slowly, carefully, but she ate. Jack smiled for the first time in longer than he could remember. "We're gonna figure this out," he said again, quieter this time, like a promise. And somewhere in the stillness of that Montana morning, with the frost melting and the mountains watching, two broken things began the long, uncertain work of healing. The morning after bringing Ember home, Jack woke to the kind of cold that crept through the walls and settled in your bones. The thermometer outside the kitchen window read 28 degrees, and the sky was the color of old pewter. He dressed in layers, the way Catherine had always insisted, pulling on wool socks and a flannel shirt that still smelled faintly of wood smoke from last winter's fires. He made oatmeal on the stove, ate it standing up while looking out at the barn. The structure seemed smaller somehow in the gray light, more vulnerable. Steam rose from his coffee mug, and he wrapped both hands around it, drawing what warmth he could. His right eye ached the way it sometimes did when the weather changed, a dull throb behind the socket that reminded him of everything he'd lost. But this morning that ache felt different, less like punishment, more like anticipation. When he stepped outside, the air bit at his face. Frost clung to every surface, transforming the ordinary into something crystalline and strange. His breath formed clouds that hung in front of him before dissolving. The walk to the barn felt longer than usual, each step deliberate as his boots crunched through the frozen grass. He carried a bucket of warm water he'd heated on the stove, knowing the pump outside would be too cold for a sick horse to drink comfortably. Inside the barn, Ember was lying down again, but her head was up, alert. When the door creaked open and Jack's silhouette filled the frame, her ears swiveled toward him, not with fear, but with something else. Awareness, maybe even expectation. "Good morning, girl," Jack said, his voice still rough from sleep. "Brought you something warm." He approached slowly, the bucket handle creaking in his grip. Ember watched him come closer, her dark eyes tracking his movement. When he set the bucket down within her reach, she stretched her neck forward and sniffed. Then she drank, long slow pulls that made her throat work. Jack counted 10 swallows before she stopped, water dripping from her muzzle. He knelt beside her, running his hand along her neck. Her coat was rough and dull, and he could feel every vertebra in her spine. Underneath his palm, her skin was warm, and he could feel the faint flutter of her pulse. It was irregular, sometimes strong, sometimes weak, like a radio signal cutting in and out. But it was there. That's what mattered. Her injured leg was still swollen, the heat radiating from it even through his gloves. He'd need to call the vet, he knew that. But vets cost money, and money was something he had precious little of these days. Still, there were things he could do. Cold compresses, Epsom salt soaks, rest. Sometimes the old ways worked as well as anything modern medicine could offer. He spent the next hour working around the barn, mucking out the stall, spreading fresh straw, checking the hay supply in the loft. The physical labor felt good, purposeful. It gave his hands something to do and his mind something to focus on besides the endless loop of worry that had become his default state. When he finished, he sat on a hay bale near Ember's stall and just watched her. She had rolled onto her side now, her breathing easier than it had been yesterday. In the dim light filtering through the barn's weathered boards, he could see the rise and fall of her ribcage, steady and rhythmic. Her eyes were half closed, but not in pain, in something closer to peace. Jack pulled out his phone, a beat-up thing he barely used, and scrolled through his contacts. Dr. Vivian Hayes was listed under V, because he'd never bothered to organize anything properly. He'd met Vivian 5 years ago when one of his best heifers had gone into distress during calving. She'd come out in the middle of a February blizzard, spent 3 hours in his barn, and saved both the cow and the calf. She hadn't charged him full price, said something about how good people deserved good luck now and then. He'd always liked her. She was straightforward, didn't waste words, and never made you feel stupid for asking questions. After Catherine died, Vivian had stopped by a few times, bringing casseroles and conversation he didn't really want but probably needed. Eventually, he'd stopped answering the door, and she'd stopped coming. He regretted that now. He stared at her name on the screen for a long moment, his thumb hovering over the call button. Pride and shame wrestled in his chest. Pride told him he should handle this himself, that he'd already taken enough charity from people. Shame whispered that he didn't deserve help, that he'd let too many things slip away to start asking for favors now. But then Ember shifted, letting out a low sound that wasn't quite a whinny but wasn't silence either. It was the sound of discomfort, of a body working hard just to exist. And Jack pressed the call button. The phone rang 4 times before she picked up. Thornton Creek Ranch, this is Vivian Hayes. Jack cleared his throat. Vivian, it's Jack Thornton. There was a pause, brief but noticeable. Jack, it's been a while. Yeah, it has. I'm sorry about that. Don't be. I figured you'd call when you were ready. Her voice was warm, professional, with an edge of genuine concern. What's going on? He told her about the auction, about the $5, about Ember's condition. He described the labored breathing, the swollen leg, the general state of neglect. As he talked, he realized how crazy it all sounded. But Vivian didn't interrupt, didn't laugh, didn't tell him he'd made a mistake. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I can be there in an hour. Don't give her anything to eat until I get there. Just in case. Keep her warm and keep her calm. I don't know if I can pay you right away, Jack said, the words scraping out of him like gravel. But I'm good for it. I just need some time. We'll figure it out, Vivian said simply. I'm not worried about that. See you soon. The line went dead, and Jack stood there holding the phone, feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not quite hope, but maybe its distant cousin. Relief. He went back to the house and made more coffee, then returned to the barn to wait. Ember was awake now, watching him from her position on the straw. Jack dragged a folding chair from the tack room and set it up outside her stall. He sat down, coffee mug balanced on his knee, and started talking. He didn't know why he did it. Maybe because the silence had grown too heavy over the past 3 years. Maybe because Ember couldn't judge him or offer advice he didn't want. But the words came, slow at first, then faster. He told her about Catherine, about how they'd met at the fair when he was 19, how she'd beaten him at the ring toss and he'd spent his last $5 trying to win her a stuffed bear just to save his pride. How she'd laughed and said she'd rather have a coffee, and they'd spent the next 4 hours walking the fairgrounds talking about everything and nothing. He told her about their wedding, small and simple, held right here on the ranch with wildflowers from the meadow and Catherine's mother crying happy tears. About the early years when they'd been broke but happy, working sunrise to sunset, falling into bed exhausted and content. He told her about the harder years too, the droughts that killed the grass, the cattle prices that dropped through the floor, the medical bills that piled up after Catherine's diagnosis, the way hope had eroded slowly, like water wearing down stone, until all that was left was duty and routine. And he told her about the accident, about the gate spring that snapped, the metal catching him across the face, the explosion of pain and light, about waking up in the hospital to find Catherine sitting beside him, her hand in his, her eyes red from crying, about the doctor saying the damage was permanent, that surgery might help but probably wouldn't, about Catherine squeezing his hand and saying, "We'll figure it out. We always do." Except they hadn't figured it out. Not really. He'd learned to compensate, to turn his head more, to map spaces in his memory so he wouldn't stumble. But he'd also pulled inward, grown quieter, stopped believing that things could get better. And when Catherine got sick, he'd thrown everything he had into fighting it, maybe because saving her meant he didn't have to think about saving himself. "But I couldn't save her," Jack said to Ember, his voice cracking. "I tried everything, spent everything, and she still left." The mare's ear flicked toward him. Her eyes were fully open now, dark and steady, holding his gaze in a way that felt almost human. Jack set down his coffee mug and leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "I don't know why I bought you," he admitted. "Maybe I'm just tired of watching things die. Maybe I thought if I could save you, it would mean something. Prove I'm not completely useless." He laughed, bitter and short. "Pretty stupid, right? $5 and a prayer. Ember shifted, drawing her legs under her body. With visible effort, she pushed herself up to standing. She wobbled, her injured leg barely taking weight, but she stood. And then, slowly, deliberately, she took 2 steps toward him. Jack froze. The mare stretched her neck over the stall door, her muzzle inches from his face. Her breath was warm and sweet, smelling of hay and something earthy he couldn't name. She didn't push at him or demand anything. She just stood there, breathing with him, sharing space. Jack reached up with trembling fingers and touched her forehead. Her coat was coarse under his palm, matted in places, but alive. So alive. Something broke open in his chest, something that had been locked tight for 3 years. His vision blurred, and he realized he was crying. "Okay," he whispered. "Okay, we'll both try." The sound of tires on gravel pulled him back. He wiped his face quickly, stood up, and walked to the barn doors. A dusty Subaru Outback was pulling into the yard, its bumper covered in veterinary clinic stickers and mud splatter. Vivian Hayes climbed out, pulling a battered medical bag from the back seat. She looked the same as he remembered. Mid-40s, practical short hair streaked with gray, weathered face that spoke of years working outside in all seasons. She wore canvas work pants, a fleece jacket, and boots that had seen 1,000 barns. When she saw him, she smiled, but it was tempered with concern. "Jack," she said, walking toward him. "You look like hell." "Thanks. You always know what to say." She laughed, the sound genuine and without judgment. "It's a gift. Where's the patient?" He led her inside, and the transformation was immediate. Vivian's demeanor shifted from friendly to focused, her eyes taking in everything. The layout of the barn, the condition of the stall, the hay quality, the water supply. When she reached Ember's stall and saw the mare, she let out a low whistle. "Oh, honey," she said softly, not to Jack but to the horse. "You've had a rough time, haven't you?" She set down her bag and moved slowly, talking in low, soothing tones as she approached. Ember tensed but didn't retreat. Vivian extended her hand, letting the mare sniff, then gently stroked her neck. Her fingers traced the visible ribs, the hollow flanks, the dull coat. "When did you say you got her?" "Yesterday afternoon." "And she's been lying down most of the time?" "Yeah. She stood up a little while ago, but it took effort." Vivian nodded, pulling a stethoscope from her bag. "I'm going to examine her now. Can you hold her head for me? Just keep her calm." Jack stepped into the stall and positioned himself at Ember's head, one hand on her halter, the other stroking her neck. Vivian worked methodically, listening to the mare's heart and lungs, checking her gums and eyes, running her hands along every inch of the horse's body. When she got to the injured leg, Ember flinched. "Easy girl," Vivian murmured. She pressed gently around the swollen joint, watching the mare's reactions. "This is tender. Could be soft tissue damage, could be infection in the joint. We'll need x-rays to know for sure." "How much would that cost?" Jack asked, trying to keep his voice neutral. "We can talk about that later. Right now, let's focus on keeping her alive." Vivian stood, brushing straw from her knees. "Her lungs sound bad. There's fluid there, probably pneumonia. She's severely underweight, dehydrated, and in pain. If I'm being honest, Jack, this horse should probably be euthanized. It would be the humane thing." The words hit him like a fist. "No." Vivian held up a hand. "I'm not saying we have to. I'm saying that's what most vets would recommend, and most owners would agree to. But if you want to try to save her, we can try. It's going to take time, money, and a lot of work. And there's no guarantee she'll make it." Jack looked at Ember, at those dark eyes that had watched him break down and offered no judgment, at the body that was fighting so hard to stay alive even when giving up would be easier. He thought about Catherine saying, "We'll figure it out," even when the odds were impossible. "I want to try," he said. Vivian studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "All right then. Here's what we're going to do." She spent the next 30 minutes outlining a treatment plan. Antibiotics for the lung infection, administered by injection twice a day. anti-inflammatory medication for the leg, a strict feeding schedule, small amounts of high-quality hay and grain to rebuild her weight without overwhelming her system, cold compresses for the swelling, gentle exercise once she was strong enough, constant monitoring for any changes. She needs to be kept warm and dry, Vivian said, shrugging off her jacket. And she needs someone checking on her regularly. Can you do that? I've got nowhere else to be. Good. She pulled supplies from her bag, preparing the first dose of antibiotics. I'm going to show you how to do the injections. It's not hard, but you need to be consistent. Twice a day, every day for at least 2 weeks. Jack watched carefully as she demonstrated, noting where to insert the needle, how to check for blood return, how to inject slowly and steadily. When she handed him the syringe for the second injection, his hands shook slightly, but he managed it. Ember stood still, only her skin twitching at the prick. Good, Vivian said. You're a natural. They spent another hour going over details, discussing feed types and amounts, talking about warning signs to watch for. Vivian wrote everything down in a small notebook she carried, tearing out the pages and handing them to Jack. Her handwriting was terrible, but he could make it out. When they were done, she packed up her bag and followed Jack outside. The sun had climbed higher, burning off some of the morning chill. The mountains were sharp against the blue sky, their snow-covered peaks brilliant in the light. Jack, Vivian said, pausing by her car. Why did you really buy her? He looked back at the barn, thinking about that question. About all the complicated reasons and the simple ones. I think I needed something to save, he said finally. And maybe something to save me. Vivian's expression softened. That's a lot of pressure to put on a sick horse. I know, but it's the truth. She opened her car door, then paused. You know, after Catherine died, we all worried about you. The whole town. You just disappeared. Stopped coming to church, stopped showing up at the feed store, stopped answering your phone. I know. I'm sorry. Don't apologize. Grief isn't something you schedule or manage. But I'm glad you called today, and I'm glad you're trying again. She climbed into her car, started the engine. I'll come back in 3 days to check on her. If anything changes before then, anything at all, you call me. Day or night. Understand? I will. Thank you, Vivian. That's what neighbors do. She put the car in gear, then rolled down the window. Oh, and Jack? About the bill. We'll work something out. Maybe you can fix that fence at my place, the one the elk knocked down last winter. I've been meaning to deal with it. Before he could argue, she was driving away, dust rising behind her tires. Jack stood in the yard until the sound of her engine faded, then turned back to the barn. Inside, Ember was lying down again, but comfortably now. The medication was already working. He could see it in the way she breathed, a little easier, a little deeper. He sat on his folding chair and opened the notebook Vivian had given him. The first page was titled Ember's Treatment Plan, in Vivian's scrawled handwriting. Below it was a schedule, detailed and precise. Feeding times, medication times, exercise goals, warning signs. At the bottom of the page, she'd written something else. Remember, healing isn't linear. Some days will be better than others. Don't give up on the bad days. That's when it matters most. Jack read those words 3 times, feeling them settle into his chest like stones in a riverbed. Then he closed the notebook and looked at Ember. You hear that, girl? We're not giving up. Not on the bad days. Not ever. The mare's ear flicked toward him, and for just a moment, Jack could have sworn she understood every word. The next few days fell into a rhythm that was equal parts exhausting and grounding. Jack woke before dawn, dressed in the dark, and made his way to the barn with a thermos of coffee and a headlamp strapped to his forehead. The pre-dawn cold was brutal, the kind that made his joints ache and his blind eye throb, but he didn't mind. There was purpose in it, a structure that had been missing from his life for too long. Ember would be waiting, standing now more often than lying down. Her eyes would catch the beam of his headlamp, reflecting green for a moment before he adjusted the angle. He'd check her water first, breaking the thin skin of ice that formed overnight. refilling the bucket from the heated source he'd rigged up using an old livestock tank heater Catherine had bought years ago. Then came the first feeding, a carefully measured portion of alfalfa pellets, soaked in warm water to make them easier to digest. While she ate, he'd prepare the first injection of the day. His hands had steadied after the first few attempts, muscle memory taking over. Ember had learned to tolerate it, only flinching slightly when the needle went in. He'd talk to her through it, a steady stream of words that probably meant nothing to her but everything to him. "That's it, girl. Just a little pinch. You're doing great. We're almost done. There we go." After the injection, he'd work on her leg. The swelling had started to go down, slowly but noticeably. He'd prepared cold compresses using old towels soaked in well water and wrapped in plastic bags. He'd hold them against the hot joint for 15 minutes while Ember stood patiently, occasionally sighing in what he liked to think was relief. Then came the grooming. He'd found an old curry comb in the tack room, its rubber teeth worn smooth from years of use. He'd start at her neck, working in small circles, loosening the dirt and dead hair. Ember would lean into it, her eyes half closing, her lower lip drooping in contentment. It was the first time he'd seen her relax, truly relax, and something about that simple pleasure made his throat tight. He'd work his way down her body, careful around her ribs, gentle over the hip bones that still jutted too sharply. Her coat was starting to change, he noticed. In places where he'd been grooming consistently, there was a faint shine emerging, a hint of the deep bay color she must have been before neglect had dulled her. It wasn't much, but it was something. Evidence of improvement, however small. By the time he finished the morning routine, the sun would be up, spilling gold across the valley. He'd step outside to give Ember privacy to rest, and he'd stand in the barn doorway drinking lukewarm coffee and watching the day begin. The mountains would emerge from shadow, the pine forests would shift from black to green, and the creek that ran through his property would catch the light and throw it back in diamonds. On the third day after Vivian's visit, Jack was cleaning the stall when he heard a vehicle approaching. He straightened, his back protesting, and walked to the barn doors. A red pickup truck was pulling into the yard, newer than his, cleaner, with a tool rack mounted in the bed. Parked near the house, and a young man climbed out. He was maybe 14 or 15, gangly in the way of boys still growing into their frames. He wore jeans, work boots, and a faded Carhartt jacket. His dark hair stuck out from under a baseball cap, and his face had that open, earnest quality that hadn't yet learned to hide behind walls. Jack stepped out of the barn, wiping his hands on his jeans. The boy saw him and waved, then started walking over with the easy confidence of someone who belonged outdoors. "Mr. Thornton?" the boy called out. "That's me." The boy extended his hand when he got close. "I'm Tyler Reeves. My uncle's Hank Reeves, works at the feed store in town." Jack shook his hand, noting the firm grip. "I know Hank. Good man." "Yes, sir. He mentioned you'd bought a horse at the auction, said she was in rough shape. I was wondering if you might need some help with her." Jack studied the boy, searching for the angle. In his experience, people didn't offer help without wanting something in return. "Help how?" Tyler shrugged, looking past Jack toward the barn. "However you need. I'm staying with my uncle for the year, and I don't start school until next week. I'm good with animals. Been working with horses since I was little. My grandfather trained them back in Wyoming. He taught me a lot before he passed." "Your uncle send you over here?" "No, sir. He just mentioned it, and I thought, maybe I could be useful. I don't need money or anything. I just like being around horses." He paused, then added with complete honesty, "And I'm not great at school stuff. Reading and writing are hard for me. But this, working with animals, this makes sense." There was something in the boy's face, a kind of raw sincerity that cut through Jack's instinctive suspicion. He thought about turning him away, about maintaining the isolation he'd built so carefully. But he also thought about Ember, about how much work she required, about how his back ached and his hands hurt and how nice it might be to have someone else who cared. "You know anything about treating pneumonia in horses?" Jack asked. Tyler's face lit up. "Some. My grandfather's mare got it once. We did steam treatments, kept her in a warm stall, made sure she moved around a little bit every day so the fluid wouldn't settle. Jack nodded slowly. All right, come meet her. He led Tyler into the barn, watching the boy's reaction carefully. Tyler's eyes went wide when he saw Ember, but not with pity or disgust. With recognition. Oh man, Tyler breathed. She's been through it, hasn't she? That's one way to put it. Tyler approached the stall slowly, his movements careful and measured. He didn't reach out immediately, just stood at the door and let Ember look at him. The mare's ears swiveled forward, and she took a tentative step closer. Hey there, Tyler said softly. Hey, pretty girl. You're going to be okay. We're going to make sure of it. And then something remarkable happened. Ember walked all the way to the stall door and pressed her nose against Tyler's outstretched hand. Not hesitant, not uncertain. With what looked like trust. Jack felt something shift in his chest. Her name's Ember. That's a good name, Tyler said, stroking the mare's face. A really good name. They stood there for a moment, boy and horse, and Jack saw in Tyler something he recognized from his own youth. A kind of natural understanding, a fluency in the language of animals that couldn't be taught, only cultivated. His grandfather had clearly passed something valuable down. Your uncle said you're staying with him for the year? Jack asked. Tyler's hand stilled on Ember's nose. Yeah, my parents are going through some stuff. They thought it'd be better if I stayed with Uncle Hank for a while. Get away from the city, have a fresh start. Jack heard the careful neutrality in the boy's voice, the way he'd practiced that explanation until it sounded casual. He knew that tone. He'd used it himself when people asked about Catherine in those first months after she died. Well, Jack said, if you want to come by in the mornings, I could use the help. I can't pay you, but I can teach you what I know. And there's always lunch when we're done. Tyler's face transformed, the careful neutrality cracking into genuine joy. Really? That would be amazing. I can be here early, like 6 or 6:30. I don't sleep much anyway. 6:30's fine. Bring work gloves and dress warm. Montana mornings aren't forgiving. Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Thornton. Thank you so much. Jack waved off the gratitude, uncomfortable with it. Call me Jack, and don't thank me yet. This is going to be hard work. I don't mind hard work, Tyler said, still beaming at Ember. Hard work makes sense. It's the easy stuff that trips me up. After Tyler left, promising to be back the next morning, Jack returned to Ember's stall. The mare was watching him with what he could have sworn was an amused expression. Don't look at me like that, he said. I didn't plan on having a helper, but maybe it's not the worst idea. Ember snorted softly, and Jack laughed despite himself. It was a strange sound, rusty from disuse, but it felt good, natural, like something he'd forgotten he knew how to do. That evening, as the temperature dropped and the first stars appeared, Jack sat on his porch with a blanket wrapped around his shoulders and a mug of soup going cold in his hands. He thought about the past 3 days, about the rhythm that was building, about Ember's slow improvement and Tyler's unexpected arrival. For 3 years, he'd been convinced that his life was over, that the best he could hope for was to maintain what little remained until time or circumstance took that too. He'd stopped believing in new beginnings, in second chances, in the possibility that broken things could be made whole. But sitting there in the cold with the barn light glowing warm in the distance, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not happiness exactly, but its precursor. The faint, fragile sense that maybe, just maybe, the story wasn't finished yet. Inside the barn, Ember shifted in her stall, and even from this distance, Jack could feel it. The small vibration of life continuing, of survival becoming something more than just not dying. He finished his soup and went inside to prepare for tomorrow. There would be injections to give, compresses to apply, stalls to clean. There would be a boy arriving at dawn, eager and earnest, looking for purpose in the same place Jack was searching. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And sometimes, Jack thought as he climbed the stairs to bed, sometimes a start is everything. The next morning arrived cold and clear, the sky so blue it almost hurt to look at. Jack was already in the barn when Tyler's uncle dropped him off, the boy scrambling out of the truck before it had fully stopped. "Morning," Tyler called, jogging toward the barn with a backpack slung over one shoulder. "Morning," Jack replied, surprised to find he actually meant it. They fell into an easy rhythm, Tyler absorbing instructions like soil absorbing rain. Jack showed him how to measure the feed, how to soak the pellets, how to check Ember's vital signs. The boy had good hands, gentle but confident, and Ember responded to him immediately. "My grandfather used to say horses know who's afraid and who's just careful," Tyler said as he ran the curry comb along Ember's shoulder. "He said the scared ones make them nervous, but the careful ones make them feel safe. Your grandfather sounds like he knew what he was talking about." He did. He could gentle the meanest horse you ever saw. Never used force. Never got angry. He just, understood them. Tyler paused in his grooming, staring at nothing. "I miss him a lot." Jack didn't know what to say to that, so he didn't say anything. He just worked alongside the boy in companionable silence. And after a moment, Tyler resumed his grooming. When they finished the morning routine, Jack made sandwiches in the kitchen while Tyler explored the barn, examining the tack, the tools, the structure itself. When Jack called him in for lunch, the boy bounded up the porch steps with the energy of youth. They ate at the kitchen table, Tyler demolishing 2 sandwiches and 3 cookies while asking questions about the ranch, the land, the history. Jack found himself talking more than he had in years, telling stories about his father and grandfather, about building fences in the summer heat and breaking ice on water troughs in winter, about the way the valley looked during spring runoff, when Thornton Creek swelled with snowmelt and the meadows turned emerald. "Why'd you stop running cattle?" Tyler asked, his directness startling but not offensive. Jack looked out the window toward the empty fields. "Lot of reasons. Economics. My wife got sick. I got hurt. Sometimes things just pile up until they're too heavy to carry." Tyler nodded, understanding in a way that seemed too old for his age. "Uncle Hank says sometimes you have to let go of what was to make room for what could be. Your uncle's a wise man. He tries." Tyler grinned. "He's not great at cooking though. If you ever need help with that, I'm pretty good. Mom made sure I learned before I came here. I'll keep that in mind." After lunch, they returned to the barn to check on Ember. The mare was standing by her water bucket, and when she saw them, she nickered. It was the first real sound she'd made beyond grunts and snorts, and both of them stopped in their tracks. "Did you hear that?" Tyler whispered, as if speaking too loud might break the spell. "Yeah," Jack said, something warm spreading through his chest. "I heard it." They stood there watching Ember drink, her tail swishing lazily, her injured leg bearing more weight than it had yesterday. The barn was quiet except for the sound of water sloshing and the soft murmur of pigeons in the rafters. Outside, the wind moved through the pines, a sound like the ocean Jack had never seen but could imagine. "She's going to make it," Tyler said with the absolute certainty of someone too young to doubt. Jack wanted to caution him, to explain that recovery wasn't guaranteed, that they needed to be realistic. But looking at Ember, at the way her coat caught the light streaming through the barn door, at the alertness in her eyes that hadn't been there a week ago, he couldn't bring himself to dim the boy's hope. "Yeah," he said instead. "I think she might." And in that moment, standing in a dusty barn with a sick horse and a boy he'd just met, Jack Thornton felt something he'd thought was gone forever. He felt like he had a future. Not the future he'd planned. Not the one he'd lost when Catherine died and his eye went dark. But a future nonetheless. One that smelled like hay and horse and possibility. One that required work and faith and showing up every single day. One that might, if he was very careful and very lucky, lead somewhere worth going. Tyler was already planning, talking about exercises they could do once Ember was stronger, about training techniques his grandfather had taught him, about the spring when she'd be healthy enough to ride. Jack listened, letting the boy's enthusiasm wash over him, and thought about Catherine's words. "We'll figure it out." Maybe they would. Maybe, with Tyler's help and Vivian's guidance and Ember's stubborn will to survive, they actually would figure it out. The afternoon sun slanted through the barn doors, painting everything gold. Dust motes danced in the light like snow. Ember finished drinking and turned to face them, water dripping from her muzzle, and for the first time since Jack had brought her home, she looked almost peaceful. "Same time tomorrow?" Tyler asked. "Same time tomorrow," Jack confirmed. The boy left with a wave, and Jack stayed in the barn a while longer. He had evening chores to do, medications to administer, blankets to adjust. But for now, he just stood there, feeling the weight of 3 years of grief start to lift, just a fraction, just enough to let a little light in. Outside, the mountains turned pink in the fading sun. The creek sang its endless song. And in a red barn on Thornton Creek Ranch, 2 broken creatures and 1 hopeful boy began the work of becoming whole. October arrived with a crispness that sharpened everything. The aspens on the hillsides turned gold seemingly overnight, their leaves trembling in the constant wind that poured down from the mountains. The mornings required heavier coats now, and Jack's breath hung visible in the air long after sunrise. But inside the barn, warmth was building, the kind that had nothing to do with temperature. Ember had gained weight. Not dramatically, but enough that Jack could no longer count every rib when she moved. Her hip bones still jutted, her spine still showed, but there was substance returning to her frame. The dull coat that had hung on her like old canvas was beginning to shine in patches, revealing the deep mahogany color underneath. Her eyes, which had been dim and unfocused that first day, now tracked movement with interest and intelligence. The injured leg was healing too, though more slowly. The swelling had reduced significantly, and she could put full weight on it for short periods. Vivian had come back twice more, each visit bringing cautious optimism. She'd shown Jack and Tyler how to wrap the leg for support, how to encourage Ember to walk short distances to keep the joint from stiffening, how to recognize signs of setback versus normal healing discomfort. Tyler had become as much a fixture at the ranch as the barn itself. He arrived every morning before school started, spending 2 hours working with Ember before his uncle picked him up and drove him to town. In the afternoons, he'd return, sometimes staying until dusk, helping with whatever needed doing. He never complained, never showed up late, never treated it like an obligation. For Tyler, being at the ranch wasn't work. It was escape, purpose, and belonging all wrapped into one. Jack had learned bits and pieces of the boy's story over the weeks. His parents were divorcing, the kind of messy separation that left everyone damaged. Tyler's father had wanted him to stay in Billings, to maintain normalcy, but his mother had insisted he needed distance from the conflict. Tyler himself had stopped caring what either of them wanted. He'd packed his bags without argument and moved to Ronan to live with an uncle he barely knew, in a place where everything was unfamiliar. Except it wasn't unfamiliar anymore. The ranch, the barn, the daily rhythm of caring for Ember, all of it had become home in a way his actual house never had. Jack understood that. Sometimes home wasn't a place you were born into. Sometimes it was a place you built, one day at a time, out of necessity and small acts of faith. One morning in mid-October, Jack arrived at the barn to find Ember standing at her stall door, ears pricked forward, body alert in a way he hadn't seen before. She nickered when she saw him, the sound stronger now, more insistent. When he opened the stall door, she pushed past him, not aggressively but with clear intention, and walked straight to the barn's main doors. Jack followed, curious. Ember stood at the doors, her nose pressed against the gap where they met, breathing in the outside air. Her whole body quivered with something that looked like longing. "You want out, don't you?" Jack said softly. The mare turned her head, looking at him with those dark eyes, and he could have sworn she was asking, pleading. The paddock beyond the barn was small, just a 1/4 acre of dirt and sparse grass enclosed by wooden rails. It wasn't much, but it was outside. It was sky and space and freedom, even if only in a limited sense. Jack checked his watch. Tyler wouldn't arrive for another 30 minutes. He could wait, make it a shared moment. But something in Ember's posture told him this couldn't wait. She'd been patient, accepting her confinement because her body had demanded it. But that patience had limits, and they'd been reached. He clipped a lead rope to her halter, opened the barn doors, and let her out into the cool morning air. Ember stopped just outside, her head lifting, her nostrils flaring as she took in scents she'd been separated from. The wind carried the smell of pine and cold earth, distant snow and creek water. Her ears swiveled, catching sounds that had been muffled by barn walls. Birds calling, leaves rustling, the creak of the windmill turning lazily in the breeze. Jack walked her slowly toward the paddock gate, watching her injured leg carefully. She was limping still, favoring it slightly, but moving steadily. At the gate he paused. "You take it easy out here," he said, unclipping the lead rope. "No running, no foolishness. Just walk around, get some air, and come back when you're ready." He swung the gate open, and Ember walked through. For a moment, she just stood there, as if uncertain what to do with this sudden freedom. Then she took a few tentative steps forward, then a few more. Her head lowered, and she sniffed the ground, her lips pulling at the dried grass. Not eating really, just tasting, remembering. Jack leaned against the fence and watched. The sun was climbing higher, burning off the frost that clung to everything. The mountains stood sharp against the blue sky, their peaks brilliant with fresh snow from last night's storm. The valley spread out below, a patchwork of fields and forest, roads and rivers, all of it bathed in golden morning light. Ember walked the perimeter of the paddock, her pace slow but purposeful. When she reached the far corner, she stopped and turned to face the mountains. She stood there for a long time, perfectly still, and Jack wondered what she was thinking. If horses thought in the way humans understood thinking, or if their minds worked differently, processing the world through senses and instincts that couldn't be translated into words. Maybe she was remembering running free somewhere, before whatever circumstances had led her to that auction yard. Maybe she was just enjoying the sun on her coat. Maybe she wasn't thinking at all, just existing, which was something Jack was beginning to understand might be enough. The sound of a vehicle approaching broke his reverie. Tyler's uncle's truck appeared on the road, earlier than usual, pulled into the yard, and Tyler jumped out before it stopped, his backpack flying. "Morning, Mr. Thornton," the boy called, then stopped short when he saw the empty barn doorway. "Where's Ember?" Jack pointed toward the paddock. Tyler's face broke into a grin so wide it looked like it might split his face. He dropped his backpack and ran to the fence, climbing up on the lower rail to get a better view. "She's outside. When did you let her out? How's she doing? Is her leg okay?" "About 10 minutes ago. She wanted out, so I let her out. And her leg seems fine, but we're watching it." Tyler watched Ember with the intensity of someone witnessing a miracle. The mare had moved to the center of the paddock now and was rolling, her legs kicking up in the air, her body twisting as she scratched her back against the ground. It was pure, unself-conscious joy, the kind animals expressed without embarrassment or restraint. When she stood up, her coat was covered in dust, making her look even more disheveled than before. But she was almost prancing, her movements lighter, younger. She shook herself vigorously, dust flying in clouds, then trotted a small circle, her injured leg still favoring but keeping up. "She's beautiful," Tyler breathed. Jack looked at the scarecrow of a horse, still too thin, still damaged, covered in dirt and moving with a limp. But Tyler was right. She was beautiful. Not in the way show horses were beautiful, all polish and perfection, but in the way surviving things were beautiful. Resilient, real, earned. "Yeah," Jack agreed. "She is." They spent the next hour watching Ember explore her small kingdom while completing the morning chores. Tyler cleaned the stall, filled water buckets, measured out feed. Jack organized the tack room, a job he'd been putting off for months. They worked in comfortable silence, occasionally calling out observations about Ember's behavior. When Tyler's uncle returned to take him to school, the boy lingered by the truck, reluctant to leave. "You'll tell me if anything happens, right? If she does anything amazing?" "I'll tell you," Jack promised. After Tyler left, Jack returned to the paddock. Ember was standing by the water trough now, drinking deeply. When she finished, she walked over to where Jack stood and pushed her nose against his chest. He stroked her face, running his hand down the white blaze that marked her forehead. "You're doing good, girl," he said. "Real good." The rest of the day passed in a blur of ranch work that had been neglected during Ember's crisis. Jack fixed a section of fence that had been leaning since spring, cleared leaves from the gutters on the barn, inventoried his hay supply, and realized with concern that he'd need more before winter truly set in. Each task felt manageable in a way things hadn't for years. Maybe because he wasn't working alone anymore, even when Tyler wasn't there. Maybe because he had something to work toward instead of just working to keep disaster at bay. In the afternoon, Owen Fletcher showed up unannounced. Jack recognized the dusty Subaru wagon before he recognized the man, and his stomach tightened. Owen had been a friend once, back when Jack still had friends. They'd gone to high school together. Both stayed in the valley while others left for college or cities. Owen had worked as a reporter for the local newspaper for years, before it folded, then transitioned to freelance photography and the occasional piece for regional magazines. After Catherine died, Owen had tried to maintain contact. He called, stopped by, invited Jack to coffee or dinner or just to talk. Jack had rebuffed every attempt, not cruelly but firmly, until Owen had stopped trying. Running into him in town now was awkward. Conversations reduced to brief pleasantries before one of them found an excuse to leave. Owen climbed out of his car, camera bag slung over his shoulder, and raised a hand in greeting. He looked the same as Jack remembered, maybe a little grayer, a little more worn around the edges. He wore jeans and a flannel shirt under a down vest, practical clothes for someone who spent time outdoors. "Jack," Owen said as he approached. "Hope I'm not intruding. What brings you out here?" Jack asked, his tone neutral but not welcoming. "Heard through the grapevine that you bought a horse at the Whitewood auction. Heard she was in bad shape and that you've been bringing her back." Owen glanced toward the paddock where Ember stood watching them. Also heard that Vivian Hayes said it was one of the most remarkable recoveries she'd seen, considering where the horse started. "Vivian talks too much. Vivian cares about you. There's a difference." Owen shifted the camera bag on his shoulder. "Look, I know you don't want visitors, and I know you've got reasons for that. But I'm here as a friend, not as a journalist. I just wanted to see how you were doing." Jack studied him, looking for the angle, the hidden agenda. But Owen's face showed only genuine concern, the kind that came from years of friendship that Jack had let atrophy. "I'm doing all right," Jack said finally. "Better than I was." "That's good. That's really good." Owen looked past him toward Ember again. "She's the bay in the paddock?" "Yeah. Her name's Ember." "Mind if I take a look?" Jack hesitated, then shrugged. "Suit yourself." They walked to the paddock together, boots crunching in the gravel. Ember watched their approach, alert but not frightened. When they reached the fence, Owen let out a low whistle. Vivian wasn't exaggerating. "She looks rough still, but you can see she's on the mend." He pulled out his camera, a professional-looking thing with a large lens. "You mind if I take a few pictures? Just for myself, not for publication." "Why would you want pictures?" Owen lowered the camera, looking at Jack directly. "Because it's a good story, Jack. Man buys dying horse for $5, nurses her back to health. It's the kind of thing people need to hear right now. The world's full of bad news. Stories like this remind people that good things still happen. It's not a story. It's just life. Life is stories. We're all living them whether we acknowledge it or not." Owen raised the camera again. "But I hear you. No pictures for publication. Just for me." Jack nodded permission, and Owen moved around the paddock, snapping photos from different angles. He worked quietly, professionally, occasionally murmuring to himself or adjusting settings. Ember watched him with mild curiosity but didn't approach or retreat. When Owen finished, he returned to where Jack stood. "She's got kind eyes. Even with everything she's been through, there's no meanness in her." "No," Jack agreed. "There's not." They stood in silence for a moment, watching Ember graze. Then Owen said, "Catherine would be proud of you. For this. For keeping going." The words hit Jack harder than he expected. His throat tightened, and he had to look away, blinking rapidly. "Don't. I'm not trying to upset you. I'm just telling you the truth. She always believed in you, even when you didn't believe in yourself. And this," Owen gestured toward Ember, toward the barn, toward the ranch, This is exactly the kind of thing she would have encouraged. Jack couldn't speak. He just nodded, not trusting his voice. Owen clapped him gently on the shoulder. I'll get out of your hair. But Jack, if you ever want to talk, or just want company, you know where to find me. And I mean that. After Owen left, Jack stood at the paddock fence for a long time, his mind churning with memories he'd worked hard to keep buried. Catherine planting tomatoes in the garden, her hands covered in soil. Catherine laughing at something stupid he'd said, her head thrown back, completely unself-conscious. Catherine in the hospital bed, her hand in his, telling him it was okay to be sad but not okay to stop living. I'm trying, he said aloud, to her ghost or to himself or to the wind that carried his words away. I'm trying. Ember raised her head from grazing and looked at him. Then, with the simple directness that animals possessed, she walked over and pressed her forehead against his chest. Jack wrapped his arms around her neck and let himself cry, really cry, for the first time since the funeral. The sun moved across the sky. The shadows lengthened, and in a paddock on a Montana ranch, a man and a horse held each other up. That evening, after Ember was settled back in her stall with fresh hay and water, Jack sat on his porch and opened his laptop. He hadn't used it in months, maybe longer. The battery was dead, and it took him a while to find the charger. When it finally powered on, he stared at the screen, the cursor blinking in the search bar. He typed, "Horse rescue stories." Pages of results appeared. Stories of neglected horses saved from terrible conditions. Stories of wild mustangs gentled and adopted. Stories of therapy horses helping children and veterans and people with disabilities. He read for hours, the porch growing cold around him, learning about organizations and individuals who dedicated their lives to this work. One article in particular caught his attention. It was about a ranch in Missoula that ran an equine therapy program for veterans with PTSD. The founder, a former Marine, talked about how horses could reach people when nothing else could. How their sensitivity to emotion, their non-judgmental presence, created space for healing that traditional therapy couldn't access. Jack leaned back in his chair, staring at the screen. An idea was forming, nebulous and uncertain, but persistent. What if Ember's recovery wasn't just about saving one horse? What if it could be something more? He closed the laptop before the idea could fully form, afraid of hoping for too much. But it lingered in his mind as he went inside, as he made dinner, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling. Outside, the stars wheeled overhead. The mountains stood silent watch. And in the barn, Ember slept deeply, her breathing steady and strong, dreaming whatever dreams horses dream. The next morning brought Tyler with news. He burst into the barn where Jack was measuring feed, his face flushed with excitement. "My English teacher wants me to do a presentation," he said, the words tumbling out, "about something important to me, and I want to do it about Ember, about what you're doing here." Jack paused mid-scoop. "I don't know if that's a good idea." "Why not? It's an amazing story, and I could use pictures if Mr. Fletcher would let me borrow some. Or I could take my own with my phone." "Please, Jack. This is the first assignment I've actually wanted to do." Tyler's enthusiasm was impossible to resist. Jack could see how much this meant to him, how rare it was for the boy to feel excited about school. "All right, but you clear it with Owen first about the pictures. And you don't make this bigger than it is. It's just a man and a horse." "It's not just anything," Tyler insisted. "It's important." Over the next week, Tyler threw himself into the project with an intensity Jack hadn't seen before. He interviewed Jack, recording their conversations on his phone and taking notes in a spiral notebook. His handwriting was terrible, letters reversed and words misspelled, but he didn't let that stop him. He researched horse care, horse rescue, horse therapy. He took hundreds of photos of Ember from every angle in every kind of light. Owen, when Tyler asked, handed over a thumb drive full of the photos he'd taken, along with permission to use any of them. "Tell your teacher I'm happy to come talk to the class if it would help," he'd said, which made Tyler grin. Jack watched the boy work, seeing how the project was transforming him. Tyler had always been helpful and eager, but this was different. This was ownership, pride, the realization that he had something valuable to share. The day before the presentation, Tyler practiced in the barn while Jack cleaned stalls. He'd written note cards in his messy handwriting, but he barely looked at them. The words came from somewhere deeper, from genuine understanding and feeling. People think rescue is about saving something that's broken, Tyler said, addressing an imaginary audience. But that's not really it. Rescue is about seeing value where other people see waste. It's about patience. It's about believing that healing takes time and that the time is worth it. My friend Jack bought Ember for $5 when everyone else walked away. He didn't do it because he thought she'd be useful. He did it because he saw she was still fighting. And that fighting spirit, that refusal to give up, that's what makes the difference between surviving and living. Jack stopped working, the pitchfork forgotten in his hands. He stood there listening as Tyler continued, talking about the daily care, the small improvements, the moments of setback and breakthrough. The boy's voice cracked with emotion when he described the first time Ember had walked on her own to the paddock, how it had felt like watching a miracle unfold in real time. When Tyler finished, he looked at Jack with anxious eyes. Was that okay? Did I get it right? Jack cleared his throat. Yeah, kid. You got it right. The next afternoon, Tyler came back from school practically vibrating with excitement. His teacher had loved the presentation. The class had asked dozens of questions. 3 kids had asked if they could visit the ranch and meet Ember. His teacher had submitted the project to a regional competition for student presentations about community heroes. She called you a hero, Tyler said, still amazed. I told her you'd hate that, but she said heroes usually do. Jack didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a man who'd been drowning and found something to hold on to. But he didn't say that to Tyler. Instead, he suggested they take Ember out to the paddock and work on some basic groundwork exercises Vivian had recommended. They spent the next hour teaching Ember to respond to gentle pressure, to back up on cue, to move her hindquarters over. She was a quick learner, responding to the lightest touch, eager to please. Tyler had a gift for it, his movements instinctive and smooth. Watching them work together, Jack felt something that might have been contentment. As the sun dropped toward the mountains, painting everything in shades of amber and rose, Tyler sat on the paddock fence while Ember grazed nearby. Jack, the boy said quietly, can I tell you something? Sure. My parents are getting divorced because my dad cheated with my mom's best friend. And my mom, she kind of fell apart after. That's why they sent me here. Not to protect me from the fighting, but because she couldn't handle having me around. Jack climbed up on the fence beside him, sitting close enough that their shoulders almost touched. That's rough, kid. I'm sorry. The thing is, I was angry. At both of them. At my dad for being selfish, at my mom for giving up. But being here, working with Ember, watching how much effort it takes to heal something, I get it now. Some things break so bad that putting them back together takes everything you have. And sometimes you don't have everything to give. Tyler paused, swallowing hard. I'm still mad, but I understand better. Understanding doesn't mean you have to stop being mad, Jack said. You're allowed to feel however you feel. Were you mad? When your wife died? The question was so direct, so unexpected, that Jack's first instinct was to deflect. But Tyler had been honest with him, had trusted him with pain that was still raw. He deserved the same in return. Yeah, Jack said. I was furious. At the universe, at God, at every healthy person I saw. At her, for leaving me. At myself, for not being able to save her. The anger was easier than the grief, so I held on to it. Let it build walls between me and everyone else. What changed? Jack looked at Ember, at the way the evening light caught the growing shine in her coat, at the peaceful way she moved through the grass. I bought a horse I couldn't afford to save, and she reminded me that being broken isn't the same as being finished. They sat in silence as the stars began to appear, faint at first, then growing brighter as the sky darkened. When Hank's truck arrived to pick up Tyler, the boy jumped down and gave Jack a quick, awkward hug before running to the vehicle. Jack stood at the fence long after the taillights disappeared, thinking about healing and anger and the strange ways life offered second chances. Ember came to stand beside him, her breath warm against his hand, and together they watched the night unfold. Inside the house, Jack made dinner, ate without tasting it, and returned to the laptop. He pulled up the article about the equine therapy ranch in Missoula again, reading it more carefully this time. At the bottom was a contact email. Before he could talk himself out of it, he started typing. My name is Jack Thornton. I have a ranch in the Flathead Valley and a horse I rescued from auction. I've been reading about your program and wanted to learn more. I don't know if this is something I could do here, but I'd like to understand how it works. He hit send before doubt could stop him, then closed the laptop and went to bed. That night, he dreamed of Catherine. They were young again, standing in a field of wildflowers, and she was laughing at something he'd said. When he woke, his face was wet with tears, but his chest felt lighter than it had in years. 3 days later, he got a response. The email was from someone named Marcus Webb, the founder of the Missoula program. It was encouraging and practical, offering information about training requirements, insurance considerations, and the basics of running a therapy program. At the end, Marcus had written, "If you're serious about this, come visit. See what we do. Talk to the veterans we work with. Then decide if it's right for you." Jack read the email 3 times, then called Vivian. "I need your honest opinion about something," he said when she answered. "Always do," she replied. He told her about the idea, about the email, about the small, persistent hope that had taken root. Vivian listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "Jack," she said finally, "I think it's a beautiful idea, and I think Ember would be perfect for it. But I need to ask, are you doing this because you genuinely want to help people, or because you're looking for a way to justify saving her?" The question stung, but it was fair. Jack thought about it, really thought about it. Both, maybe. Does that make it wrong? No. It makes it human. The best things we do usually come from complicated motivations. He could hear her smile through the phone. "When are you going to visit?" "Next week, if I can arrange it." "You think Ember's well enough to be left for a day? With Tyler checking on her?" "Absolutely. That boy's as competent as most ranch hands I know." After hanging up, Jack walked to the barn. Ember was dozing in her stall, one hind leg cocked, her lower lip drooping. She opened one eye when he entered, then closed it again, completely relaxed. Jack leaned against the stall door, watching her breathe, and allowed himself to imagine it. This barn filled with people who needed what Ember could offer. Veterans struggling with trauma. Kids like Tyler looking for something to believe in. People who'd lost their way and needed a quiet place to find it again. It was presumptuous, maybe even arrogant, to think he could provide that. He was barely holding his own life together. But maybe that was exactly the point. Maybe the best guides through darkness were people who knew the terrain. "What do you think, girl?" he asked softly. "You up for a bigger purpose?" Ember sighed, a long, contented sound, and shifted her weight. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the barn doors. Inside, warmth held steady. Jack smiled, and for the first time in 3 years, let himself hope for more than just survival. He let himself hope for meaning, for contribution, for a future that honored the past without being trapped by it. The path forward wasn't clear yet. There would be obstacles, setbacks, moments of doubt. But standing in that barn with a horse who'd refused to quit, Jack Thornton felt ready to try. And sometimes trying was enough. The drive to Missoula took longer than Jack anticipated. He left before dawn, the truck's headlights cutting through darkness that seemed absolute. The highway stretched empty before him, and he drove with the windows cracked despite the cold, needing the sharp air to keep him alert. The radio played old country songs he half remembered from his father's time. Voices singing about loss and redemption and the stubbornness required to keep a life together. Tyler had arrived at 5:30 to take care of Ember, despite Jack's protests that it was too early. The boy had insisted, showing up with a thermos of coffee, his uncle had made and determination written across his young face. Jack had gone over the routine 3 times, even though Tyler knew it by heart. Check her leg for heat or swelling. Make sure she drinks. Watch for any signs of distress. Call immediately if anything seems wrong. I've got this, Tyler had said with the patient tone of someone reassuring a worried parent. Go learn what you need to learn. Now, as the sun broke over the mountains behind him and spilled gold across the valley ahead, Jack wondered what exactly he was doing. Driving 2 hours to visit a therapy ranch run by people who actually knew what they were doing, people with training and credentials and experience. What did he have? A half-blind cattle rancher with a rescued horse and good intentions. It seemed laughably inadequate, but he kept driving. Mountain View Healing Stables sat on 20 acres of rolling land just outside Missoula, with the Bitterroot Mountains rising dramatic and snow-capped to the west. The facility was more extensive than Jack had imagined. A main barn that looked newly built, several smaller outbuildings, multiple paddocks and pastures, an indoor arena, and what appeared to be a lodge or meeting hall. Everything was well-maintained, professional, the kind of operation that required serious funding and serious commitment. Jack parked his truck near the main barn, feeling increasingly out of place. His boots were scuffed, his jacket was old, and he probably should have shaved. But Marcus Webb had said to come as he was, so here he was. A man emerged from the barn as Jack climbed out of the truck. He was in his 50s, built compact and solid, with close-cropped gray hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to command. He wore jeans, work boots, and a fleece jacket with the ranch's logo embroidered on the chest. "Jack Thornton?" he called out, his voice carrying easily across the distance. "That's me." The man strode forward with purpose, extending his hand when he reached Jack. His grip was firm, his palm calloused. "Marcus Webb, good to finally meet you in person. How was the drive?" "Long but peaceful. You've got a beautiful setup here. 20 years in the making. Come on, I'll give you the tour, then we can talk about what you're thinking." Marcus led him through the facility, explaining as they walked. The main barn housed 12 horses, all of them rescues, all of them carefully selected and trained for therapy work. Each horse had its own story, its own trauma, its own journey back to trust. Marcus introduced them by name, sharing their histories with a reverence that made it clear these weren't just tools for a program. They were partners. "This is Dakota," Marcus said, stopping at a stall where a gray gelding watched them with calm eyes. He came from a situation where he'd been beaten regularly. Took 2 years before he'd let anyone touch his face. Now he works with combat veterans who have anger issues. Something about his patience, his willingness to forgive, it reaches them. They moved to the next stall. "This is Willow." She was a broodmare in a puppy mill-type operation, bred every year until her body gave out. She's got arthritis, can't be ridden, but she's incredible with women who've experienced trauma. She understands what it means to endure. Jack listened, absorbing not just the information but the philosophy behind it. These horses weren't chosen despite their damage. They were chosen because of it. Their brokenness gave them empathy, made them safe for people who were also broken. In the indoor arena, a session was in progress. A young man, maybe mid-20s, stood in the center with a chestnut mare. Marcus gestured for Jack to watch from the observation area, a glassed-in section that allowed viewing without disturbing the work. The young man wasn't riding. He wasn't even touching the horse. He was just standing there, and the horse was circling him slowly, maintaining a consistent distance. A woman, presumably a therapist, stood outside the circle, calling out occasional instructions or observations. "That's Ryan," Marcus said quietly. 3 tours in Afghanistan. Came home with PTSD so severe he couldn't be in crowds, couldn't hold a job, couldn't sleep. That's Juniper he's working with. Watch what happens when he changes his breathing. Ryan took a deep breath, visible even from this distance. The horse's ears swiveled toward him. He exhaled slowly, his shoulders dropping. The horse stopped circling and turned to face him. For a long moment, they just looked at each other. Then Ryan lifted one hand, palm out, and the horse walked forward until her nose touched his palm. The young man's face crumpled. He pressed his forehead against the horse's neck, and his shoulders shook. Juniper stood perfectly still, solid and accepting, while Ryan cried into her mane. Jack felt his own throat tighten. He understood what he was witnessing. Not training, not therapy in any clinical sense. Connection, recognition, the wordless acknowledgement between two beings who understood suffering. "How long has he been coming?" Jack asked. 6 months. When he started, he couldn't make eye contact with anyone, human or animal. Now he's talking about going back to school, maybe becoming a counselor himself. Marcus turned to Jack. "That's what this work does. It doesn't fix people. It gives them a safe place to start fixing themselves." They spent the next 3 hours talking. Marcus explained the logistics, the challenges, the rewards. He was honest about the difficulties. The insurance requirements, the liability concerns, the emotional toll of working with traumatized people, the funding struggles that never entirely went away. But he was equally honest about the impact. The veterans who found peace, the children who learned to trust, the families that healed together. "You don't need a fancy facility to start," Marcus said over lunch in the lodge. "You need horses with the right temperament, proper training for yourself and anyone who helps, insurance, and a genuine commitment to serving people who are hurting. The rest you can build as you go." "What kind of training are we talking about?" "There are certification programs. Path International is the main one, professional association of therapeutic horsemanship. Takes time and money, but it's worth it. Gives you credibility, teaches you skills you need, connects you with a network of people doing this work." Marcus leaned back in his chair. "But here's what I really want to know, Jack. Why do you want to do this?" Jack had been expecting the question, had rehearsed answers on the drive up. But sitting across from this man who'd dedicated 2 decades to this work, the rehearsed answers felt hollow. So he told the truth. 3 years ago, I lost my wife to cancer and my sight in one eye to an accident. I spent those 3 years convinced my life was over, that the best I could hope for was to maintain what little I had left until it was time to quit. Then I bought a dying horse for $5. And she reminded me that being broken doesn't mean being finished. I want to offer that same reminder to other people. I want something good to come from all the pain." Marcus studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he smiled. "That's exactly the right reason. The wrong reason is thinking you can save people. The right reason is knowing you can't, but offering them a place where they might save themselves." Before Jack left, Marcus walked him back to his truck. The afternoon sun was slanting low, turning the mountains purple and the fields gold. Several horses grazed in the nearest pasture, their heads down, tails swishing, utterly peaceful. "You've got something here, Jack," Marcus said. "I can feel it. That horse of yours, Ember, she's been through something real. People will recognize that. They'll trust her because she's earned the right to be trusted." He pulled a business card from his pocket, writing on the back, "This is my personal cell. You call me when you're ready to move forward. I'll help however I can. We need more places doing this work, especially in rural areas where resources are scarce." Jack took the card, clutching it like a lifeline. "Thank you. For your time, for your honesty, for all of it. Thank you for caring enough to drive up here and ask questions. A lot of people have good intentions. Fewer are willing to put in the work." Marcus extended his hand again. Safe drive home. The return trip passed in a blur. Jack's mind raced with possibilities and practicalities, excitement and fear tangling together until he couldn't separate them. By the time he pulled into his driveway, full dark had fallen, and the ranch looked like something from a painting. The barn glowed with warm light, the house was dark and patient, and the mountains were silhouettes against a sky full of stars. Tyler's bike was still leaning against the barn. Jack found the boy inside, sitting on a hay bale and reading by lantern light. Ember was lying down in her stall, but her head was up, and she nickered when she saw Jack. "How'd it go?" Tyler asked, jumping up. "Good. Really good." Jack ran his hand along Ember's neck, feeling the warmth of her, the solidness. "I think we're going to do this. Really do it." Tyler's face lit up. "Seriously? You're going to start a therapy program?" "Eventually. There's training I need, permits, insurance, 100 other things. But yeah, I think that's where this is heading. He looked at the boy. I'm going to need help. Real help, not just morning chores. Are you interested? Are you kidding? Yes. Absolutely yes. Tyler was practically bouncing. What do we need to do first? They spent the next hour talking, Jack sharing what he'd learned, Tyler asking questions faster than Jack could answer them. When Hank arrived to pick up his nephew, Tyler was still talking, planning, dreaming out loud. After they left, Jack stood in the quiet barn, breathing in the smell of hay and horse and possibility. Ember had stood up, and she pushed her head over the stall door, demanding attention. Jack obliged, scratching behind her ears the way she liked. This is going to be your job, you know, he told her. Helping people who are hurting, teaching them what you taught me. Think you can handle it? Ember blew out through her nostrils, a sound that seemed like agreement, or maybe just contentment. Either way, Jack smiled. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Jack enrolled in an online course through Path International, spending his evenings studying horse behavior, trauma-informed care, safety protocols, and program development. Tyler helped quiz him, reading questions, aloud and celebrating when Jack got answers right. The boy's dyslexia made reading difficult, but he approached it the same way he approached everything else, with determination and creativity, finding workarounds when standard methods failed. Vivian connected Jack with an insurance agent who specialized in equine operations, and together they worked through the maze of liability coverage and requirements. It was expensive, more than Jack had anticipated, but Vivian helped him apply for grants from agricultural foundations and veteran support organizations. To his surprise, 2 of them came through, providing enough funding to cover the first year. Owen Fletcher, despite Jack's initial resistance, wrote an article about Ember's recovery and Jack's plans for the ranch. It ran in a regional magazine and then got picked up by a larger publication. Suddenly, Jack's phone was ringing with calls from people asking questions, offering support, wanting to visit. It was overwhelming and uncomfortable, but also validating. People cared about this. People needed this. By mid-November, the first snow had fallen, blanketing the valley in white. Ember had filled out significantly, her ribs no longer visible, her coat thick and glossy. Her injured leg had healed enough that Vivian cleared her for light riding, and Jack spent careful hours working with her in the small arena he'd cleared and fenced. She was gentle under saddle, responsive and willing, with none of the resistance or fear he might have expected from a horse with her history. Tyler rode her too, and the connection between boy and horse was something Jack couldn't quite put into words. Tyler, who struggled with reading and writing, who felt stupid in school and inadequate at home, became someone entirely different on Ember's back. Confident, capable, whole. One afternoon, as they were cooling Ember down after a ride, Tyler said, "My mom called last night, first time in 3 weeks." Jack waited, letting the boy work through whatever he needed to say. "She apologized for sending me away, for not being able to handle things, for all of it. She's in therapy now, trying to work through stuff." Tyler's voice was carefully neutral. "She wants me to come home for Thanksgiving. How do you feel about that?" "Scared, angry, hopeful." Tyler stroked Ember's neck, his movements automatic and soothing. "All of it at once. But I think I want to go. I think I need to try. Then you should go. And if it doesn't work out, you've got a place here. Always." Tyler looked at him, eyes bright with emotion. "You mean that?" "I mean that." The boy ducked his head, but not before Jack saw him wipe at his eyes. They finished caring for Ember in comfortable silence, the kind that didn't require words to communicate understanding. Thanksgiving week arrived with bitter cold and more snow. Tyler left on Tuesday, nervous but determined. Jack spent the holiday alone, as he had for the past 3 years, but this year felt different. He made a small turkey, more out of tradition than hunger, and ate dinner while watching the sunset paint the mountains pink and gold. Ember had been turned out into the paddock despite the cold, and Jack could see her from the kitchen window, her dark shape moving against the white landscape. His phone rang as he was washing dishes. "Tyler." "Hey kid," Jack answered. "How's it going?" "It's weird. Awkward. But okay, I think. Tyler's voice sounded small and far away. Mom's trying really hard. Dad came by for dinner and they were civil. That's something, right? That's definitely something. I miss Ember. Is that stupid? Not even a little bit. They talked for 20 minutes, Tyler sharing small details about his family, about the strange experience of being back in his old house. When they hung up, Jack felt the weight of responsibility settle onto his shoulders. This boy, this complicated, brave, struggling boy, was counting on him. Counting on the ranch, on Ember, on the stability of a place where things made sense even when the rest of the world didn't. Jack couldn't let him down. December brought a phone call that changed everything. A woman named Patricia Morrison, a counselor who worked with the VA hospital in Kalispell, had read Owen's article. She was starting a pilot program for veterans struggling with PTSD and wanted to know if Jack would be willing to participate. Just one afternoon a week, just a handful of veterans, very low-key and informal. Jack's first instinct was to say no. He wasn't ready. He hadn't finished his training. He didn't have the proper facilities. But then he thought about Ryan, the young veteran he'd watched at Marcus's ranch, crying into Juniper's mane. He thought about all the men and women who'd served and come home broken, looking for something that might help them feel whole again. He said yes. The first session was scheduled for a Tuesday in mid-December. For veterans, all men, all dealing with varying degrees of PTSD. Patricia would be present, along with Jack and Tyler, who'd insisted on helping despite his school schedule. They'd work in the barn and the paddock, doing simple groundwork exercises, nothing complicated or demanding. Just presence. Just connection. The night before, Jack barely slept. He cleaned the barn until it gleamed, organized tools, set up folding chairs, checked and rechecked everything a dozen times. At 3 a.m, he gave up on sleep and went out to sit with Ember. She stood patiently while he brushed her, talking through his fears and doubts. What if I can't help them? What if I say the wrong thing? What if this whole idea is a mistake? Ember turned her head and lipped at his jacket, her way of asking for treats. Jack laughed despite his nerves. You're right. I'm overthinking it. When the veterans arrived the next afternoon, Jack's hands were shaking. But Tyler was there, steady and calm, and that helped. Patricia made introductions, keeping things casual and low pressure. The 4 men were younger than Jack expected, ranging from late 20s to maybe 40. They stood awkwardly in the barn, hands shoved in pockets, shoulders tight with tension. Jack decided to just be honest. I'm new at this, he said. I'm not a therapist. I'm not a trained anything. I'm just a rancher who bought a dying horse and found out that healing her helped heal me. I thought maybe it could help you too, but I could be completely wrong. One of the men, a tall guy with a beard and haunted eyes, smiled faintly. You can't be worse than the group therapy they tried to make me do at the VA. At least horses don't ask how that makes you feel. The others laughed, and the tension broke a little. Jack brought out Ember, and the men's attention shifted immediately. She walked calmly between them, unafraid, curious. When she reached the bearded veteran, she stopped and sniffed his hand. That's Ember, Jack said. For months ago, she was starving and sick, barely able to stand. Everyone at the auction thought she was finished. But she kept fighting, kept showing up, and slowly, day by day, she got stronger. The man stroked Ember's nose, his expression softening in a way that made him look years younger. She's beautiful. They spent 2 hours together that afternoon. Jack and Tyler showed the veterans how to groom, how to lead, how to read Ember's body language and respond to her cues. They talked about pressure and release, about earning trust through consistency, about the way horses demanded authenticity because they couldn't be fooled by pretense. Patricia mostly observed, occasionally asking questions that guided conversation without forcing it. The veterans gradually relaxed, some more than others. One man hardly spoke the entire time, but he spent 20 minutes brushing Ember with a focus that suggested meditation. Another told stories about working with military dogs overseas, the words pouring out of him like he'd been holding them back for years. When the session ended and the men were leaving, the bearded veteran paused at the barn door. Thank you, he said to Jack. For real, this helped. After everyone had gone, Jack and Tyler sat on hay bales in the gathering dusk, exhausted but exhilarated. Ember dozed in her stall, unbothered by the attention she'd received, comfortable in her role. That was amazing, Tyler said. Did you see the way that one guy, Marcus, how he changed when he was working with her? It was like he forgot to be afraid. I saw it, Jack said quietly. I saw all of it. Over the next weeks, the Tuesday sessions became routine. The same 4 veterans came every week, and slowly progress happened. Not dramatic breakthroughs, but small shifts. More eye contact, easier laughter, longer conversations. One of the men brought his wife to meet Ember, introduced her with pride like showing off something precious. Another asked if he could volunteer, help with barn chores, be useful. Patricia was delighted with the results and started talking about expanding the program, bringing in more veterans, maybe adding a weekend session. Jack found himself saying yes to things that would have terrified him months ago, trusting that he and Ember and Tyler could figure it out as they went. Word spread. A counselor from the high school called, asking if troubled students could visit the ranch as an alternative to detention. A women's shelter reached out, wondering if survivors of domestic violence could benefit from equine therapy. Each request required careful consideration, proper protocols, appropriate support. But the core remained the same, horses and humans healing together. By late January, Tyler's presentation about Ember had won the regional competition and advanced to the state level. The boy was terrified and thrilled in equal measure. Jack helped him practice, offered feedback, drove him to Helena for the final presentation. When Tyler took the stage in front of judges and an audience of hundreds, Jack sat in the back row, his heart in his throat. Tyler's voice shook at first, but as he talked about Ember, about the ranch, about everything he'd learned, strength flooded in. He showed photos, told stories, spoke from a place of deep personal understanding. When he finished, the applause was thunderous. He didn't win first place. He came in third, which was remarkable for a freshman competing against juniors and seniors. But Tyler didn't seem disappointed. On the drive home, he talked about how much he'd learned, about colleges that had programs in equine therapy, about the future that suddenly seemed possible. I think I want to do this for real, he said. Like as a career. Is that crazy? It's not crazy at all, Jack said. It's exactly right. February brought a warm spell. False spring that melted snow and fooled the crocuses into blooming early. Jack spent a morning repairing fence line that winter had damaged, Tyler working alongside him. They developed an easy partnership over the months, able to work in silence or conversation as the moment required. They were stretching wire when Owen Fletcher's car appeared on the road. Jack braced himself, expecting requests he wasn't ready to fulfill, but Owen's face was serious when he got out. Jack, I need to talk to you about something, Owen said without preamble. Preston Caldwell from Caldwell Holdings has been asking questions about your ranch. He's buying up land in the valley, planning some kind of resort development. Jack's stomach dropped. He'd heard Caldwell's name before, knew the company's reputation for aggressive acquisition. What kind of questions? Property values, zoning, your financial situation. Owen's expression was grim. I think he's going to make you an offer. And Jack, it's going to be substantial. Enough to solve every money problem you've got and set you up for life. Tyler had stopped working, listening intently. He can't sell, the boy said fiercely. This place, what we're building here, it matters. I know it matters, Owen said gently. But I also know Jack's been struggling financially for years. This would be life-changing money. I just wanted to give you a heads up, let you think about it before Caldwell shows up. After Owen left, Jack and Tyler finished the fence work in silence. The warm sun felt wrong suddenly, too bright, too cheerful for the dread settling in Jack's chest. He'd known, somewhere in the back of his mind, that this couldn't last, that the bills and debt and reality would eventually catch up. But he'd allowed himself to hope anyway, to believe that doing good work might be enough. That night, alone in the house, Jack spread his financial records across the kitchen table. The numbers were brutal. The ranch was barely breaking even, and that was before factoring in the money he'd spent on Ember, on training, on insurance. The small grants had helped, but they wouldn't last forever. He was one bad winter, one major emergency away from losing everything. When Preston Caldwell's black Mercedes pulled into the driveway 3 days later, Jack was ready for him. The man was exactly what Jack had expected. Expensive suit, confident smile, handshake that asserted dominance. He made small talk about the weather, complimented the view, admired Ember in her paddock before getting to the point. "Mr. Thornton, I'll be direct. I'm prepared to offer you $600,000 for this property. That's more than fair market value, and I'm willing to close quickly." Caldwell pulled papers from his briefcase, spreading them on the hood of his car. "This valley is going to develop whether you participate or not. This is your chance to benefit from that growth. $600,000. Enough to pay off every debt, buy a smaller place, fund the therapy program properly. Enough to secure Tyler's future, to never worry about money again." Jack stared at the numbers on the contract, feeling them pull at him like gravity. "What would you build here?" he asked. "Luxury vacation homes. The area is perfect for it. Mountain views, privacy, close enough to Kalispell for amenities but remote enough to feel exclusive. We'd preserve some of the natural landscape, of course, make it part of the appeal." Jack looked past Caldwell at the barn, where Ember stood watching them. He thought about the veterans who came every Tuesday, about the quiet progress happening in that space, about Tyler finding purpose after his world had shattered, about his own journey from grief to something that felt like healing. "I appreciate the offer," Jack said slowly, "but I'm going to have to decline." Caldwell's smooth expression cracked slightly. "Mr. Thornton, I don't think you understand. This is an exceptional offer. You won't get another one like it." "I understand perfectly, and my answer is no." "Can I ask why?" "From what I understand, you're barely keeping this place running. This money would solve all your problems." Jack thought about how to explain it, how to make someone like Caldwell understand that some things couldn't be reduced to numbers on a contract. "Because this place isn't just property. It's purpose. And I've learned that purpose is worth more than security." Caldwell packed up his papers, his movements sharp with frustration. "If you change your mind, you have my contact information. But don't wait too long. My patience and my offer both have limits." After he left, Jack stood in the driveway for a long time, watching the dust settle. His phone buzzed. A text from Tyler? "Did you sell?" Jack typed back, "No, we're staying." The response was immediate. "Good." That evening, Jack called a meeting. Tyler, Vivian, Owen, Patricia Morrison, and Marcus Webb via video call. He told them about the offer, about his decision, about the reality of their financial situation. "If we're going to make this work long-term, we need a real plan," Jack said. "Not just good intentions and hope. A sustainable model." They spent 3 hours brainstorming, problem-solving, building something viable. Marcus shared what had worked at his ranch, what hadn't, lessons learned the hard way. Patricia talked about grant opportunities through the VA and other organizations. Vivian offered to volunteer her services at reduced rates. Owen suggested a fundraising campaign, using the story that was already getting attention. Tyler, who'd been quiet through most of the discussion, finally spoke up. "What if we made it a nonprofit? My teacher mentioned something about that, how it could help with taxes and grants and stuff. I don't really understand it, but maybe it's worth looking into?" Marcus's face lit up on the video screen. "That's exactly right. A 501(c)(3) designation would open up funding sources you can't access as a for-profit. It's paperwork and bureaucracy, but absolutely worth it." By the end of the meeting, they had the outline of a plan. It would take work, lots of it, and time, and continued faith that this mattered. But it was possible. Actually, genuinely possible. After everyone left, Jack walked out to the paddock where Ember stood under the stars. The night was clear and cold, the kind of cold that made everything feel sharp and real. He climbed over the fence and stood beside her, his hand on her neck. "I turned down more money than I've ever seen in my life because of you," he said. "Because of what you represent." I hope that was the right choice. Ember turned her head and rested her chin on his shoulder, her breath warm against his neck. It was an embrace, or as close as a horse could come to one. Jack closed his eyes and let himself feel the weight of it, the trust, the connection, the wordless promise that they were in this together. Spring came early that year, melting snow and bringing green back to the valley. Jack officially filed paperwork to establish Second Sight Equine Therapy as a non-profit organization. The name had come to him one night while reading Second Sight, not as in prediction, but as in learning to see differently, learning to see what mattered. They held an open house in April, inviting the community to see what they were building. More than 50 people showed up. Veterans and their families. Students from Tyler's school. Town council members. Vivian brought her whole family. Owen documented everything, his camera clicking constantly. The highlight was watching Ember work. Jack had worried she might be overwhelmed by the crowd, but she moved through it with calm confidence, greeting people, accepting affection, demonstrating the groundwork exercises they developed. Tyler gave a short presentation, his voice steady now, comfortable in his role as educator and advocate. One woman, elderly and using a cane, stood at the paddock fence for a long time just watching. When Jack approached, she smiled. "I lost my husband last year," she said. "Cancer. I felt so lost since then, like part of me died with him. But watching you and this horse, seeing what you've built here, it reminds me that life can surprise you, that it's not over until it's over." Jack didn't trust himself to speak. He just nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. By summer, Second Sight had 3 horses. A retired racehorse named Thunder that Marcus had helped Jack select and transport. An older mare named Patience that a family donated when they could no longer care for her. Each horse brought different strengths, different personalities, different ways of connecting with people. But Ember remained the heart of it all. She was the one who'd started everything, the $5 horse who'd refused to quit. People requested her specifically, drawn by her story, by the quiet dignity she carried. Jack sometimes watched her work with veterans or struggling kids and marveled at her capacity for understanding, her intuition about what each person needed. Tyler spent the summer living on the ranch, having convinced his mother that it was where he needed to be. He'd grown, filling out and gaining confidence, his voice deeper, his hands surer. He was talking about college now, about programs in animal science and therapeutic riding. He'd reconnected with his parents on his own terms, maintaining boundaries but building bridges. One evening in late July, Jack and Tyler were sitting on the porch after a particularly good session with a group of veterans. The air smelled like hay in summer, and the mountains were purple against the sunset sky. "Jack," Tyler said, "can I ask you something?" "Always. Do you ever regret it? Spending that $5? Taking on all this responsibility?" Jack thought about the question, really considered it. The past 9 months had been exhausting, challenging, sometimes overwhelming. There had been setbacks and struggles and moments when he'd questioned every choice. But sitting here, watching Ember graze peacefully in the paddock, knowing the lives that had been touched, the connections that had been made, the healing that was happening, there was only one answer. "Not for a second," he said. "Best $5 I ever spent." Tyler smiled. "Yeah, I think so too." They sat in comfortable silence as stars began to appear, and Jack thought about the journey from that auction yard to this moment. How death had led to life, how brokenness had led to wholeness, how one small act of faith had rippled out in ways he never could have predicted. Catherine had been right all those years ago. They had figured it out. Not the way they'd planned, not the way they'd hoped, but figured it out nonetheless. And somewhere, Jack liked to think she was watching, proud of the man he'd become, grateful for the purpose he'd found in the most unexpected place. Inside the barn, Ember nickered softly, calling to Thunder across the darkening paddock. It was the sound of home, of safety, of belonging. The sound of second chances and stubborn hope, and the simple, profound miracle of surviving long enough to discover that survival could become something more. Jack stood, stretching his back, feeling his blind eye ache the way it sometimes did, but not minding. That I had taught him to see differently, to look harder, to value what remained rather than mourning what was lost. "Come on," he said to Tyler. "Let's get them settled for the night." They walked to the barn together, man and boy, teacher and student, partners in this work they'd built together. Behind them, the mountains stood eternal and indifferent. Ahead, horses waited, warm and solid and real. And in the space between, in a red barn on a Montana ranch, healing continued, one breath at a time, one day at a time, one connection at a time. The story didn't end there. Stories like this never really end. They just continue, unfolding in the daily rhythms of care and work and showing up. In the veterans who found peace. In the children who learned to trust. In the boy who discovered his calling. In the man who learned that sometimes the life you save saves you right back. But that particular evening, as Jack closed the barn doors and walked back to the house under a sky full of stars, he felt complete in a way he hadn't since Catherine died. Not because the pain was gone, but because he'd found a way to make it mean something. To transform loss into purpose, grief into grace, $5 into a legacy. And that, Jack thought as he climbed the porch steps, was more than enough. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.